Welcome back to our part 2 in naming compounds. So in this video, we will be talking about another types of naming compounds. In our previous video, we talked about naming ionic compound. And on this video, we will talk about naming covalent compound. But what is covalent compound? And what are the rules in naming covalent?
And what is covalent compound? Now, it is a combination of two non-metal elements. So, in this compound, you will see only two non-metals. Okay, rules in naming covalent compound. The first rule, name the first non-metal on the left by its elemental name. The second rule, you have to name the other non-metal by its elemental name and change the suffix with an IDE ending. And then the third rule is you have to use the prefixes mono, di, tri, and etc. to indicate the subscript number of that element in the molecule. And again, I know wala kang naintindihan kay kadamo sang pinanghambal ko and it sounds confusing. But don't worry, the next slide will help you better understand how to name covalent compound. Let's have examples or an example of covalent compounds. Let's try to name this example. So we have an example of a compound which is covalent compound because it is composed of two nonmetals. We have carbon and oxygen and both of them are nonmetals. Now how are we going to name this compound? Let's have the first rule. The first rule is you have to name the first nonmetal on the left by its elemental name. So the same. You have to copy the name of this first element on the periodic table. So the symbol for C is what? Carbon. Yeah, you try to check on your periodic table and try to look for the symbol of C, and then you will see there the name which is carbon. The second rule, name the other nonmetal by its elemental name and change the suffix with an IDE ending. It's like the same rules in naming ionic compound. So again, we're going to give the name for the second element, which is the symbol of O, which is oxygen. But always remember, you have to change again the suffix with an IDE ending. So instead of making it oxygen, we make it oxide. Alright, so it's carbon oxide. But this does not end here because we have step number 3 or rule number 3 in naming covalent compound. Now what is that? You have to use prefixes mono, di, tri, etc. to indicate the subscript number of that element in the molecule. When we say prefix, it's a word that we need to add at the beginning of a word. Example, we have mono, di, tri, and tetra, etc. Now, in this example or compound, we have a subscript of 2, and that subscript of 2 is intended for oxygen, meaning to say in this compound we have 2 oxygen and we have only 1 carbon. Carbon has no subscript, or there's no wala siya 2 or 3 or 1 because carbon is already understood that it has 1, so there's no need for us to write 1 as a subscript, so it's already understood nga 1 ang carbon. But anyway, let's focus first sa aton nga oxygen because oxygen has a subscript of 2. Okay? So we need to use a prefix of di because we have 2. But let me show you first all the examples of prefix. So these are the first one. If we have a subscript of 1, we use the prefix of mono. If we have a subscript of 2, we use di. If we have 3, that is tri. And then if we have 4, we have tetra. And then if 5, we have penta. And then if 6, we have hexa. 7 is hepta. 8 is octa. 9 is nona. And then 10 is deca. Now in our case here, or in our example here, we have CO2. We have a subscript of 2. So what are we gonna use? What type of prefix? Okay, so we're gonna use di because we have a subscript of 2. And where are we going to put di? Our element. So when we say prefix, again, we have to place or put this at the beginning of the word. So we put di at the beginning of oxide. So it will become dioxide, meaning we have two oxygen in this compound. So the name of this covalent compound is carbon dioxide. This rule number 3 only applies in naming covalent compound. It does not apply in naming ionic compound. Again, it only applies in naming covalent compounds. Next example in naming covalent compound, we have, okay, this example. I know that this is really familiar, or it's familiar to you, the H2O, and we all know that this is water. But how are we going to give or name this? So the first rule, name the first nonmetal on the left by its elemental name. We all know that H stands for hydrogen, and hydrogen is a nonmetal. So we have to name this as hydrogen. We just copy the name from the periodic table. And then the second rule, again, we have to name the other nonmetal by its elemental name and change the suffix with an IDE ending. So our next or second element, which is O, stands for oxygen, which is also non-metal. So we just copy from the periodic table oxygen. But again, always remember we need to change the suffix with an IDE ending. So instead of making it oxygen, it will become oxide. So again, it does not end here because we have rule number 3. In rule number 3, we have to use the prefix mono, di, or tri to indicate the subscript number of that element in the molecule. Now, if you notice, we have another subscript here, which is number 2. And that subscript is intended for hydrogen. Meaning, in this compound, we have 2 hydrogen and we have 1 oxygen. We say 1 oxygen, although there's no number 1 subscript in oxygen, because there's no need for us to put number 1 in oxygen because it is already understood that oxygen is 1. So no need to put 1. So now, since we have a subscript of 2, we need to use a prefix. But where are we going to place the prefix? And our prefix are, if it's 1, mono, 2, di, and so on. So since we have a subscript of 2, we are going to use di. And where are we going to put di? Is it going to be in hydrogen or in oxide? Is it going to be dihydrogen or going to be dioxide? So what do you think? Alright, it's going to be dihydrogen. So it will be placed at the beginning of hydrogen because the subscript 2 is a subscript for hydrogen. That number is intended for hydrogen. We have 2 hydrogen. Now, what about the oxygen? For the oxygen, we have 1. So we still need to use a prefix for the oxygen because it is considered as 1 oxygen, although there's no number 1 as a subscript, but we still need to use a prefix of mono. So we're going to place mono, or we're going to put this in front or in the beginning of oxide. So it will become monoxide. Okay? So this compound is called dihydrogen monoxide. Sometimes there's also another name for H2O, which is dihydrogen oxide, which is also correct. If you say dihydrogen monoxide, that is also correct because you use mono to indicate that oxygen has 1. But you can also use oxide. You can just delete mono. Both of them are correct. Dihydrogen monoxide or dihydrogen oxide. Both are correct. Okay? Okay, let's have practice to see if you understand the topic that we discussed in naming covalent compound. First example, try to check or examine what do you think is the name of this compound. Okay, the name of this compound is dinitrogen monoxide. Dinitrogen because we use di as a prefix for a subscript of 2, which is a subscript of nitrogen. And oxygen is it's considered as 1, so we use mono to indicate a subscript of 1, so dinitrogen monoxide. It has also another name, which is dinitrogen oxide, which is also correct because when we say oxide, that means we have one oxygen. If we say monoxide, that means we have also one oxygen, so both are correct. Next example. What do you think is the name of this covalent compound? Uh-huh. So that is carbon tetrachloride. So the first element is C, stands for carbon, and then the second element is chlorine, which is the second element, or nonmetal. Both are nonmetals, by the way. So the first element is carbon, and then the second element is tetrachloride. So we use the prefix tetra because we have a subscript of 4 for chlorine. So we use tetrachloride. And then we added the suffix of IDE at the end of the word chlorine. So instead of chlorine, it becomes chloride, and it becomes tetrachloride because it has a subscript of 4. Next example. Try to guess what's the name of this compound. Alright, so this is dinitrogen tetraoxide. So both elements has their own subscript. The nitrogen has a subscript of 2, which is we use prefix of di, and then the oxygen has a subscript of 4, which we use a prefix of tetra. So dinitrogen tetraoxide. And always remember that we always put a suffix of IDE at the end of the word or at the end of the element, and this only applies on the second element only. We do not put IDE suffix on the first element. It's always on the second element. Always remember that. Thank you. Thank you again for attending this class, and I hope to see you on my next topic again. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Thank you.